So, Netflix just dropped part 3 of Disenchantment, and with the new batch of episodes came a slew of world building, lore, characterization, laughs, adventures, and elfo abuse. But instead of giving an overview of everything that happened in this season, or part, I want to focus on one specific aspect of part 3 and compare this to parts 1 and 2, and that is the serialization of Disenchantment. In television shows, there are two main formats a show can take: a serialized format and an episodic format. A serialized format has continuing storylines that span over the course of an entire season. Think of pretty much every drama show. By contrast, an episodic TV show presents each episode as a self-contained story, meaning you could jump in at any point in the series without needing much prior knowledge to understand what's happening. This is the format that most animated sitcoms, such as Disenchantment's contemporaries, The Simpsons and Futurama, went for. Disenchantment was an interesting case as it seemed to be going for a mix of both serialization and self-contained episodes throughout its first two parts, which made up season 1. The first few and last few episodes of both parts 1 and 2 had a serialized format, where the cliffhanger ending of one episode would lead directly into the opening of the next. For example, part 2's opening episode, The Disenchantress, ends with Bean walking down a staircase to hell, which is picked straight back up on again in the next episode, aptly titled Staircase to Hell. It's required that an audience member watches these two episodes in order, otherwise they would be confused by the opening of the latter. But the middle episodes of parts 1 and 2 were standalone episodic adventures that didn't always directly tie into each other. For instance, the heist plot of the Dreamland job has little to nothing to do with Derek's character journey in the following episode, Love's Slimy Embrace, so not much would be lost on an audience member who watched these two episodes out of order. The main through line between them is Lucy buying and owning the bar, but that's a rather minor element of Love's Slimy Embrace. It's not like you need an explanation of why Lucy owns the bar to understand what's happening in that episode. Where part 3 really differs from the previous two parts is that it sticks to a more serialized format for most of its run. Pretty much every episode develops on something meaningful established in a prior episode. For example, in the first episode of part 3, it's revealed that Prendergast has been murdered. So the third episode, Beanie Get Your Gun, is spent investigating what happened to him. They find out it's the priestess and chase her down in the next episode, which naturally leads into the Steamland saga covered in episodes 4 and 5, and then the boat trip back to Dreamland in episode 6. Even when an episode doesn't end in a cliffhanger, the events that occurred in the previous episode will still be playing on a character's mind in the next, keeping a constant narrative flow throughout part 3. Now, I do not believe that serialized television is inherently better than episodic television. There are shows that owe their success to their episodic format, but I think in Disenchantment's case, serialization fits the tone and scope it's going for. Disenchantment is basically a mystery show. Part 3 opens with several overarching mysteries that are investigated over the course of the season, and Bean literally plays detective in 2 episodes. Part 2 also presented several mysteries in its opening episodes, like Bean's heritage and the secret treasure the elves are looking for. But this became a frustration I had with Part 2, as it felt like it was presenting the audience with several tantalising mysteries, but then avoided expanding on them, in favour of more non sequitur adventures. Take the episode The Lonely Heart is a Hunter, for example. The episode has a subplot about Bean investigating some old runes that are hinted to have a connection to her mother, but this basically leads nowhere as Bean gets scared and gives up on investigating them. We don't find out anything about them for the rest of part 2, halting that story in its tracks. What the episode chooses to develop instead is the relationship between Zog and a bear woman named Ursula, a character who has only appeared in a single episode to date. I do actually enjoy this plotline. I think it's funny and gives Zog some decent character development. But when the episode prioritises a somewhat frivolous love affair over expanding on the mysteries it's already set up, it can be frustrating to sit through, because I'm just waiting for them to get back to that mystery. There are still some instances in part 3 where they bring up a non-resolved mystery or plotline, but don't follow up on it straight away. Like, it should annoy me that they mentioned Levo's quest early in the season, only for it to not develop any further until the last episode. But it doesn't, because there's a narrative excuse for the other characters to abandon Levo and his plotline. They have the more pressing issue of Dagmar to deal with in that moment. And after that, I'm so swept up in the murder and betrayal stuff that I don't mind them leaving Levo's plot thread for a little longer. Another result of part 3 taking a more serialised approach is that it makes meaningful changes to Disenchantment's status quo. After part 1 ended with several series-altering cliffhangers that seemed like it was taking the show in a radically different direction, I was disappointed by how in part 2 everything reverted back to normal by the end of episode 3. Sure, there were a few status quo changes, but for the most part, part 2 still followed Bean, Elfa and Lucy's shenanigans around Dreamland, not that fundamentally different from part 1. But this isn't a criticism that I can level at part 3. For one thing, there are no episodes of Bean just goofing around drinking. She's always trying to get somewhere, figure something out, or face some threat to the kingdom. The constant rising urgency prevents the show from feeling as if it's in some stagnant status quo. The only time I was in fear of Disenchantment resetting to a status quo was at the beginning of episode 3, Beanie Get Your Gun. When Derek reinstates power to Zog, the townspeople don't care about Bean supposedly being a witch, and Zog's forgotten about Oddval's coup attempt. The characters even comment on how weird the situation is.
Weird. Why is Oddval being so friendly? And why is everyone so casual about the fact that Dad and I are supposed to be dead?
With Bean and Zog being reinstated, it almost seemed like the whole coup subplot had been entirely pointless, especially as the opening of the episode hinted that Pendergast might not actually have died. But the episode's ending underlines the lasting impact this coup had, by confirming Pendergast's death and having the priestess become a fugitive from the kingdom, basically writing out 2 major supporting characters. On the subject, Pendergast's death is the first one in Disenchantment that I was genuinely shocked by, just because of the show's willingness to kill off a recurring character without going back on it. They have done similar deaths before, like when Jerry was killed, but Jerry was divorced enough from the main cast and setting of Dreamland that his absence didn't feel as noticeable. It's not like his death bared any repercussions on how Dreamland functioned as a kingdom, for example, but Pendergast's death does. You're reminded of his absence anytime you watch a scene with Zog losing his mind, or see Turbish and Mertz without their commander. Even if Pendergast is somehow brought back later, his death was still felt throughout the whole of this season. Part 3 of Disenchantment managed to capture my intrigue by taking its story and characters to interesting new places. My hope for Part 4 is that everything Part 3 built toward gets a decent payoff. By the end of Part 3, most of the plot lines have still been left open-ended, with even more opening up, and others being teased at. In one case it looks like they might be rehashing an older plotline. My fear for Part 4 is that all these storylines are going to trip over each other, that Part 4 is to juggle so many different plot lines that it's not going to be able to devote enough time to each of them, making their resolutions feel rushed and underdeveloped. I think it's on Part 4 to intertwine all these plot threads, so everything comes together to form one satisfying conclusion, unless they're planning on continuing the show after Part 4, in which case I hope Part 4 is a more streamlined and focused version of Part 3. Speaking of satisfying conclusions, I couldn't think of one for this video, so let's end off by discussing 3 times Disenchantment Part 3 referenced 3 other Matt Groening cartoons. Starting with the most obvious, the Trip to the Moon roller coaster seen in the episode Freakout is a reference to the second Futurama episode, The Series Has Landed, where the Planet Express crew visit a theme park on the moon. In particular, the roller coaster's moon face bears resemblance to the mascot, Craterface. Look, it even has part of the roller coaster going through its eye, just like how Craterface always had a beer bottle shoved through their eye, which itself is a reference to a silent film from 1920 called A Trip to the Moon. Wait, actually maybe the roller coaster is just supposed to be a reference to that film. Secondly, the joke about the king's servants, Vip and Vap, living in unlawful cohabitation is a reference to the characters Akbar and Jeff, who are a gay couple from Matt Groening's comic, Life in Hell. They also share similar character designs. And finally, I don't think this was intentional, but Elfo skating on Dagmar's oily back reminded me of Bart Simpson's skateboarding. Now try to get that image out of your mind. Good night, everybody.